Very much, Mr. Speaker. It's indeed an honor for me to rise in my place for the first time in 2012 and contribute, hopefully for the last time, to this debate concerning the non-merits of the Long Gun Registry. Mr. Speaker, as you know, I come from Alberta, and Albertans have a particular wisdom, I would suggest, when it comes to the virtue both of long guns and their need within respective industries. And my friend, the member from Red Deer, gave a very great speech regarding his experience growing up in rural Alberta. And my experience is somewhat different, but certainly I share with those sentiments. So when I was home for the Christmas break, a number of my constituents and other individuals who I came in contact with at various festivities and social gatherings were quite adamant that the time for this Long Gun Registry had long passed, and it was time that we get on with the work of having it finally abolished because of its lack of usefulness and its lack of merit. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest, and I would suggest to members of this House, that the Long Gun Registry, from its inception, represents all that is wrong with what's come to be known as the modern nanny state. The Long Gun Registry, although conceived out of a very, very tragic incident in Montreal, was ill-conceived from the beginning. It was premised on government and legislators' overestimation of their ability to solve any wrongs in society. It was premised that through legislation and through this...
If I can tell the honourable member that his earpiece is beside the microphone and it's causing a lot of feedback through the... Thank you. The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
I apologize, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize to members of the House. The registry represents legislators and government's overestimation of their ability to solve and prevent human frailties. And there are some things that governments can't do, and preventing tragedies such as the one at École Polytech or the one at a decade later at Dawson College are those types of events that no amount of registration, though any amount of law, any amount of legislative registry, and at no cost will those types of incidents, those types of tragedies necessarily be prevented. Because the Long Gun Registry, Mr. Speaker, was founded on an incorrect premise. And the premise is quite simple, and we've heard about it today from members on this side of the House. And the premise is simply that criminals will register their guns. And we know that that's a faulty premise. They will not. These are individuals who are involved in gun violence and who are involved in these tragic circumstances, flaunt society's norms, they flaunt society's values, and they certainly flaunt society's laws. So they're not the types of individuals who are going to register their firearms. Licensing, of course, is quite a different thing than registration, and nothing in C-19 or in its predecessor legislation, the Private Members Bill in the last Parliament that was sponsored by the member from Portage-Lisgar and almost passed. Nothing in this piece of legislation or in its predecessor affects the licensing mechanism. And licensing is important because licensing deals with the individual. It's the individual that's going to have ownership of that firearm or ownership of the ammunition to use the firearm. And that person is going to have to satisfy the authorities that he is competent and capable, that he's taken the requisite firearm safety course, that criminal record checks have been done on the individual and they've come back negative, and therefore he's entitled to a license. So the licensing mechanism has value. The registration mechanism has no value. And I've heard members on the other side of the House frequently state, well, you know, we register vehicles and we register our dogs, but we're not going to register our firearms. But what they ignore is a clear line of constitutional demarcation between the federal government's responsibility and the responsibility of the provinces with respect to property and civil rights. Mr. Speaker, as you know, that property and civil rights was specifically given to the provinces under the British North America Act and now the Constitution Act. And with respect to dog and cat licensing, that's been further delegated to the municipalities. But the federal government can only have a registry if there's some valid criminal purpose. Because we do have registries. We have a sex offender registry. We have a DNA data bank. Because these are registrations that registries that actually have a valid criminal purpose. But I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd submit to all members of the House that valid criminal purpose is absent in the Long Gun Registry. Therefore, there is no criminal purpose. Therefore, if a registry of long guns was to be maintained, it would have to be maintained by the provinces under their provincial jurisdiction under Section 92 of the British North America Act. And Mr. Speaker, as you might know, and as some members do know, I sit on the Public Safety Committee, and I sat on the Public Safety Committee in the last Parliament, and we heard evidence on both sides of this debate, and there are people who truly and genuinely believe that this registry has merit. But we also heard from groups and from police officers and from experts, admittedly on both sides of this debate, but I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, and to members of this House, that there is no evidence that this registry has ever prevented a single crime or that it's ever saved a single life. In fact, the evidence is quite the opposite. And proponents of the Long Gun Registry sometimes cite the Mayor Thorpe tragedy to somehow support their contention that the Long Gun Registry has merit. And I find that perplexing, because on that day in March of 2005, 4 members of the RCMP tragically died at the hands of Mr. James Roscoe, a terrorist, a madman who flaunted all of society's laws and tragically murdered 4 brave Mounties before taking his own life. But proponents of the Long Gun Registry somehow cite the fact that there was an accomplice who was subsequently, 2 accomplices who were subsequently convicted of aiding and abetting that offense admittedly through registration, that is somehow a success. But it's not. It's a failure. 4 Mounties died. And we know that police officers cannot and do not rely on the Long Gun Registry in their everyday service. We heard of a situation in, I think, 2006 in Laval, Quebec, where a police officer responding to a domestic incident did a Long Gun Registry search, and it came back negative, so she didn't call for backup, went in to deal with this domestic disturbance, and was shot. Because the information in the registry is so defective and so inaccurate that that police officer relied on the Long Gun Registry to her own peril. So there's no evidence that a single life has been saved or a single crime has been stopped by this ill-conceived concept that was brought in by a previous government. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you may know, I live in the city of Edmonton, and sadly and tragically, Edmonton holds the distinction of, at least in last year, of having the most murders in Canada, 47. But not a single one was committed by a long gun. The weapon of choice in Edmonton is the knife, and more victims were stabbed than any other method or mode of homicide. So in my city, of course, there's no correlation between violent crime and long guns. But on the day that we were last here before the Christmas break, there was a tragic incident also in Alberta, in southern Alberta. And that was a triple homicide and followed by a suicide at Claresholm, Alberta, near the city of Lethbridge. And we subsequently, and then there was a 4th individual that was seriously injured. So we have 3 murders, 1 attempted murder, and a suicide. We found out that the weapons used in that incident were registered. So, Mr. Speaker, on both sides of gun crime, when murders occur, whether or not they're registered or not registered, society and legislatures and this type of mechanism are ill-equipped and cannot prevent those types of tragedies. Individuals use registered weapons to cause tragedies and to cause tragic incidents, and we see from a city like in mine where knives and handguns are the predominant weapon for homicide and for murders. So the registry does not prevent crime. Those who believe otherwise, I think, are well-intentioned, but their feelings and their theories are not borne out by the evidence. It's time that we put this registration mechanism to bed and reallocate the resources that were spent into real law enforcement, into real purpose and activities that can actually be purposeful in the prevention of crime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The
Questions and comments. The honourable member for
Bopali-Moilou. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, allow me to express my indignation in light of what my colleague has just said. If the register is not reliable, it's because it was voluntarily neglected by this government. Amnesty after amnesty. The registry ended up full of holes to some extent. If I had neglected to pay my telephone bill, my electricity bill, of course I would end up without any lights on, and I would not have been able to contact my electricity company to get the lights back on in my house. After having voluntarily created a crisis, how can my colleagues across the way persist in saying that this registry should be dismantled when they in fact caused the destruction of the registry of the last 6 years? How can my colleague continue to support this position?
Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his intervention, but I disagree with his premise. The Long Gun Registry is not effective, not because of amnesty. The Long Gun Registry is ineffective because it was based on a false premise, on the premise that criminals and those who are predisposed to gun crime would register their weapons. They don't. Therefore, the evidence or the data in the data bank is faulty and unreliable.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Charlottetown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was interested in my colleague's constitutional analysis and his analysis of the division of powers. In particular, he stated that the purpose of the registry seems to conflict with the exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces in that it infringes on property rights, which would therefore imply that somehow the Long Gun Registry is non-constitutional as offending the Constitution Act. And I would be quite interested to hear him explain the legal challenges that have been made to the validity of the Constitution Act. Certainly there's a well-financed lobby. And I would also ask if this is in fact within the exclusive constitutional jurisdiction of the provinces, why this legislation is going so far as to interfere with the admittedly legitimate exercise of power of the provinces when we hear from provinces that they want to maintain the records to enact their own. So I find it a little bit troubling that we hear that this is a matter of provincial jurisdiction, yet an element of the legislation is to infringe upon that jurisdiction.
Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member from Prince Edward Island for his good questions. With respect to the constitutional jurisdiction, as he no doubt will be aware, there was a constitutional challenge led largely by my home province, the province of Alberta, to argue, as I just argued, that the registry was in fact ultra vires because of division of powers. That argument was not successful because the courts ruled that it attempted to have a valid criminal purpose. Attempted to is the key word. I think the evidence is quite borne out, if you listen to my intervention and the speaker's previous, that it does not prevent crime, does not save lives, and therefore the fact that it was an attempt at a valid criminal purpose does not a valid criminal result make. And for that reason, this registry has to be put to bed.
Time for a short question and response. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your remarks. I was just wondering, with respect to the possession and acquisition licensing program, I understand that firearms will still require a license, and I'm wondering what you feel about how that system works to protect the public.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Well, as I said in my comments, and I thank the Parliamentary Secretary for her question, I support the licensing mechanism because the licensing mechanism deals with the individual. The registration deals with the gun, with the property. And there's no correlation between safety and crime prevention between the gun, But there is safety and crime prevention with respect to the person that uses the gun, and therefore to get a valid license, they'll have to pass criminal record checks. They'll have to take a firearm safety course and demonstrated that they are capable of using that firearm and using it safely. So I support the licensing mechanisms which are unaltered by C-19.
Resuming debate, please the débat. The honourable